to the cloud and make sure it's working. And it seems like it is. Okay, great. Well, hello. Good to have all of you here to the worker resistance or resistance to work panel. We've got a lot of interesting things to talk about, and it seems to be changing on the ground on a daily basis. And therefore, I thought it would be informative and entertaining and maybe provocative to put together a panelist of folks who have been engaged with the labor movement, with worker rights for a number of years from different vantage points. And we've got a panel of 5 people, 5 speakers, and 4 at the, well, I think maybe, let's see, no, we've got 4 of our 5 are in attendance. And I will look to see if our 5th person is here. Let me introduce myself. I'm the moderator. My name is Bob Bruno, and I'm a professor of labor and employment relations at the School of Labor and Employment Relations. And I've been there for roughly 25 years, so lots of great LIRA conferences. And we've had some good virtual ones, frankly. And I'm sure this will be an interesting session. Let me just quickly introduce to all of our guests who our panelists are, and we will have them speak in the order in which I'm introducing them, and they're listed in the program. First is Hamilton Nolan, who's a labor reporter for In These Times. Many of you have probably read his work, and he's joining us from assignment somewhere in West Virginia. He's in an airport. There he is. So we'll begin with Hamilton, and then Hamilton will be followed by Assistant Professor Augustus Wood, and Gus is also at the School of Labor and Employment Relations. So he is a colleague of mine, and I'm thrilled to have Gus joining the panel. And then Gus will be followed by Rebecca Givens. Professor Givens is at Rutgers University and has been a friend and a colleague for many years. And then Ruth Milkman, who is at the City University, New York's Graduate Center, and Ruth has been doing great work in this field for a long time. And then our 5th panelist is Maria Figueroa from SUNY Empire State College, their School of Labor Studies. And I will keep my eye open for Maria if she's able to join us. So here's what we're going to do, because we only have an hour, and I've already taken up too much time talking. I'm going to allow the panelists to make some opening comments, to say something thoughtful, provocative on this subject of what we're seeing in the labor market, what workers are doing, what union members are doing. Is this some sort of strike? Is it forms of resistance? What are we seeing here? Where's this going? What role is the labor movement playing in it all? I'll give them 3 or 4 minutes to make some comments, and then we'll throw it open to questions. I'll have some questions if possible. Members of the panel may want to throw some questions out, but we'll certainly turn to our guest, and we'll use the raised hand system to do that. All right, so without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Brother Hamilton Nolan and allow him to get us started. Hamilton, you're up.
Thank you for having me. I'm writing a book about the labor movement right now, and I've been in West Virginia all week talking to fast food workers. So I apologize for being at the airport, but I'm happy to be here. And it seemed to me that this panel was asking basically 2 big questions. One being what's happening in labor right now and why, and 2 being, is the labor movement going to be able to take advantage of it in any sort of broad or lasting sense? So I think on the first point, the context for everything we talk about here, I think, has to be 40 years of rising inequality in America. I think that the decades of inequality in America since Ronald Reagan are the big trend that is driving all other trends in America in labor and in politics. And I think that we always have to keep that in view and keep that in context, because the death of what my parents' generation saw as the American dream being you can have one job and you can support a family and you can send your kids to school, that has been essentially evaporated in America. And that I think is the most powerful force driving everything that happens in labor. Obviously, the more recent occurrence obviously was COVID and the pandemic, which threw millions and millions, tens or hundreds of millions of workers into crisis in two main ways that I saw in my reporting, which was either that people were suddenly thrown out of work and they were unemployed overnight. They were in an unemployment crisis. They had trouble accessing state unemployment. They were overnight in a very serious crisis in that sense, or they were deemed essential workers. They had to keep working. Their health was at risk. Their family's health was at risk. And they put themselves at risk in that way. And they came through the pandemic and kept on working and didn't get that much out of it at the end of the day. So those two things together covered so many millions of workers in America that I do think that was a seriously radicalizing event for millions and millions of working people. An event that made people realize in a really tangible way that their job does not care about them, that it doesn't care about their lives. And public opinion polls show that the approval of organized labor is at an all-time high. And I think that's very much a result of those two big things. I think that it's also important context for what we talk about to say that, all of the positive wins for organizing that get a lot of attention, like Amazon and Starbucks, and also the strike wave that got a lot of attention last year, a big wave of strikes across the country. All those things are great, but in the big picture, they have not been widespread enough to move the needle. Union density continues to decline year over year. So, I mean, we do have to realize that for all the little green shoots that we're seeing in the big picture, we still have not turned around that half-century long decline of organized labor. And to touch on the second question, which is, what is organized labor going to do about this? I mean, this is a lot of what my book is about, and I've talked to a lot of labor leaders over the past several years. And I mean, I'm sorry to report that, the reality is that there's no plan to organize workers on the scale of millions of workers, which is what we need to be talking about to move the needle on organized labor. There's no plan for it. There's no resources for it. There's no central coordinating structure within the labor movement that's prepared to do it. Vast swaths of this country are basically what I think of as organizing deserts, just like food deserts. There's not a plan and there's not resources. So that is a big, big thing. I'm sure we'll talk about more, but to be brutally honest, I have not seen the structure and the establishment of the labor movement prepared to take advantage of the moment that we're in a serious way. Thank you.
You're muted, Bob.
Well, there's a problem that you do have to address when you're doing things this way. Thank you, Gus. I was noting that I appreciated Hamilton's very strong and thoughtful remarks, and he set a really good example. I didn't even have to give him a prompt in the chat to close out. He got it done inside the 4 minutes, so well done. Very succinct. We'd expect that out of a reporter. All right, so let's go. Gus Wood, you're up.
Thank you so much. And Hamilton, I appreciate your comments. I think you're right on the money. I'm going to take it in a different direction and build off of what you said. Starting with the first question, the idea that this is a resignation, I believe that that's probably the incorrect phrasing of how we should look at this. Because again, there's a consciousness, there's a political desire at the heart of what I'm calling this is a mass general strike that's very reminiscent of the general strike during the Civil War in 1862 by the slaves to walk off the plantations as a protest to the conditions of work, and then lend their expertise and hands to the Union Army in winning the war. But on their way out, they left political messages, like they burned the plantations, that they broke tools, they did all the things to show that this was a strike against work. And when you see the strike happening recently, they're all leaving signs on walls saying capitalism does not work, pay workers a fair wage, we're organizing for the future. So they're making it clear that this is a political maneuvering, and the mass media portraying this as a resignation. It kind of takes away the political efficacy and the strategy of the workers and their agency to protest the conditions of work, which are the terrible conditions, the terrible wages, et cetera. And so I think that's the first point. But I think the main thing that we are seeing based off of what Hamilton just said is that we're having so much activity, both non-union and union, in terms of people are striking against the sub-proletarianization of work, meaning that since 2008, and really before then, most of the jobs that have been created have been work that does not meet or exceed the cost of living, and also creates mountains of debt and other factors that we'll talk about over the panel. And so what you see happening is a more mainstreaming of sub-proletarian work, low wage, non-benefit, non-union, and also unstable. That was the big thing that a lot of the people who went out on strike and quit their jobs talked about, is the instability of work. So this is very much so a politically conscious action by many of the people doing the work. And so, especially when you look at African Americans and the Black working classes, because much of their work now that they've been gentrified out of urban spaces into these deserts that Hamilton brought up, these organizing deserts where the only jobs they have are warehouse work or very small retail spaces, there's not much for them to aspire to in terms of labor opportunities, because financial capital has completely destroyed the capacity for viable paying jobs to be offered, especially in segregated spaces in these rural suburban areas where formerly urban Black people were forced out of because of gentrification. And finally, on the last point of what the union movement can do, I agree in that there is no legitimate structure nor an actual attention to the organizing of so many of these workers who are becoming disillusioned with sub-proletarian work. And unfortunately, I don't see the labor movement taking this question seriously, which is why you've seen a lot of rank and file committees forming in a lot of organizations and unions. And what they're saying is that we need workers to make decisions for ourselves and start thinking differently about a neo-labor movement. And so, again, there has to be a complete change in tactics and strategy, and a lot of it is coming out of the voices of the workers who have gone on all these strikes that have come out with contracts that don't look half as good as they should under this inflationary crisis. So I'll stop there, and I just left my 2 points, and I'm sure we'll discuss more as we go on. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gus, and again, much appreciate staying within the time limits, and some really serious questions getting raised here. All right, so we now have my friend and colleague, Professor Givens from Rutgers. Becky?
Thanks, Bob. And I really appreciate Bob not only organizing and pulling us all together, but organizing this so that we'll mostly be having a conversation, not presentations. I'm excited to hear back and forth between everybody here. I'm going to try to keep to 3 brief points. I won't do justice to any of them. The first one actually dovetails with what Gus just said about the rank and file sort of taking matters into their own hands. I think one modest, but I guess noteworthy trend has been the rejection of tentative agreements, where workers have essentially said F you to their bargaining committee that might have been disengaged or somewhat clandestine, and have either gone out or stayed out on strike in spite of the those in the room at the table reaching a tentative agreement. And I think that's really significant, and it sets the tone for potentially stronger contracts and perhaps increased militancy. Again, I think, this panel is kind of set up with, it's a bit of a Rorschach with how much of an optimist or a pessimist you are. So I think that's noteworthy. It's modest, but some of the strikes in long-standing unionized places like John Deere and others in the past 6 months to a year, that's been a significant factor. The other thing I'll say, and this is sort of I don't know if it's an inverse of how Hamilton put it, but I think we don't know exactly, but my hunch is that something like Starbucks is really punching above its weight in terms of influence. We know the numbers are small, right? So you would need, I don't know, 1,000, maybe 500 or to 1,000 Starbucks to be unionized to equal one large Amazon fulfillment center, right? So each Starbucks victory is amazing and also very small in scale, but I do feel really strongly that the influence is far beyond that. These workers, just hearing these workers talk about how they now understand the brokenness of labor law, how they understand what a captive audience meeting is, the kind of inanity of the boilerplate union busting talking points, all of that, I think is really significant. Many of these young workers are going to go on to work in a lot of different workplaces. They're not likely, in most cases, to see out their careers at Starbucks, and they're all over the country. So they're in Oklahoma, they're in Arizona, Texas won their first union election, I think, yesterday. So I do think that there's something in those of us who are educators, there's only so far you can go in the classroom, but I think workers understanding what a really strong anti-union campaign means, what labor law looks like, what it does and doesn't do, I think is significant, and taking that with them the rest of their working lives. Then the other thing I'll say is I do think, in some sectors, there's a sense of questioning what structural change is really needed. And I'll use the example of higher ed right now. And I think, there's a nascent coalition of higher ed labor united, which is unions with and without bargaining rights. And in some cases, AAUP advocacy chapters forming a coalition, which we call, and I'm part of it, so I'm speaking from that perspective, wall to wall and coast to coast, right? And so we're saying to the extent that higher ed has been unionized, it's been totally stratified. So maybe professors were unionized, but they certainly weren't talking to staff. They often weren't talking tenure stream and adjuncts enough, or grad workers, and saying, what would it mean to have staff, faculty, grad workers led in most cases by the most precarious workers? And what would that kind of formation look like? Pushing federal legislation, state legislation, pushing at their own bargaining tables, and pushing their national unions to take things on as an industry. So I think that is also something that shows potential. I'll say there's not clear results yet, but in terms of creating space for organizing that could have significant impact, I think something like Higher Ed Labor United is also one too. So and I'll leave it there. I'm excited to get into it with everybody.
Well, I just want to note, I don't know if it's the first time, maybe for me, but I think it's the first of one of these really prestigious LIRA panels where a panelist actually put FU together, put the letters together in such an effective way, without offending anyone. That was wonderful, Becky. That's well done.
Thank you.
Okay, so our colleague and good friend, Dr. Ruth Milkman, will speak next, and then Ruth, if Maria joins us, I'll introduce her when you finish. If not, we will bring us all back into conversation. Okay.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Bob, for organizing this panel and recruiting all of us, and I'm excited to be part of the conversation. I agree with most of what's been said. I want to just point to a couple issues that haven't yet been raised. So one is, it's probably obvious to everyone in this Zoom, but labor shortages really are empowering for labor. And I think we've seen that in a whole bunch of different ways recently, in the last year, basically. So, of course, those strikes last fall were one example of that, because the ability of employers to do permanent replacements, which prevented many unions from launching strikes in the past. sort of evaporated. That was an empty threat in a company like John Deere that had 10,000 employees, where they were going to find 10,000 replacements. So that's one aspect. And the prompt for this panel that we were all asked to speak to also mentioned the so-called Great Resignation. I actually think that's a misnomer, as somebody already said. It's more like a great exploration or something like that, of people taking advantage of the labor shortage to look around and get jobs that they prefer to the ones they might have had in the past. Anyway, this is not going to last. So that's the bad news. It's really been very empowering. And I think, and the third way is, the Amazon campaigns and the Starbucks campaigns. The risk of losing your job is not as daunting, especially for a job like that, when there's lots of jobs out there. So all those things. But unfortunately, this is temporary. And I think so is the so-called Great Resignation. Some people did leave the labor market, mostly for pandemic related reasons. And that was enabled by not the labor shortage in this case, but rather the stimulus money, and many people were able to save money in the early phases of the pandemic since they weren't doing anything, or the activities that they normally spent money on. But we know that, at least for ordinary working people, very few people can afford to leave the labor force permanently. They work because they need to survive economically, and that hasn't changed. So I don't see that as a long-term thing. So let me just turn to one other thing, which is my obsession, and some of you have heard this before, so forgive me, but which is something that might be more enduring, and that is the phenomenon of a generation of college-educated workers who are facing the post-Great Recession labor market and precarity and debt and all the things that other people have mentioned, and are less easily intimidated by employers than folks with less education or maybe not the same expectations or self-confidence that these workers have. And I feel like we've seen this before this last year, which has been so dramatic, but it's been building up for a while. So unionism among journalists, for example, has been flourishing in recent times, which, by the way, I think also amplifies everything else, because they get it and they write about all this in a way that maybe more extensively than would be the case otherwise. So that has like an extra added bonus to it. Rebecca was already talking about higher education, college adjuncts, graduate workers, all that. Obviously, that's sort of the extreme case of lots of education and really crummy job situations. But it also extends to beyond that, including to Starbucks, which we've seen in the reporting that people have done, that not all the workers, obviously, but many of the leaders are indeed college educated. It was even true in Staten Island at Amazon. Now we're seeing these Apple stores try to unionize. So, this generation has become active in other arenas too over the last decade or so, starting with Occupy Wall Street, in my view. But at that time, unions weren't really their thing. And now suddenly, well, not so suddenly, in the last 5 years or so, maybe, that's really changed. And so unions are cool to these folks, and they are, giving it a try. And of course, the real question that I guess I share Hamilton's pessimism, not only has this not made a dent in the desperately low union density that we've been facing for a while now, but whether or not these campaigns, amplified as they are by the brand names and the media amplification of all this, that, you'd think from talking to reporters who until a year ago didn't know anything about labor, like this was some kind of revolutionary development. They don't really understand always the bigger context. So I know people on this call do. But the other prospect is, are any of these things going to result in contracts or lasting organization? I mean, I don't know the answer. I'd like to think that, some of them will, but I think, that's a question we really need to think about. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. I want to turn it now to the committee of the whole and give us all a chance to offer thoughts and questions. But before I do that, and Maria does not look like she's on the call, I want to just turn back to the panelists you've made some comments, you've heard your colleagues make some comments. Before we throw it open, you might have heard something that someone said that triggered a thought, and you said, you know what, I'd like to just comment on that. So if you have a thought that occurred because of something you heard one of your colleagues on the panel say, now would be an opportunity for you to speak up. So I'm just going to kind of look around and see if, okay, Rebecca, yeah, go ahead.
I'll jump in just in response to what Ruth said, and I have to give props to Hamilton, who led the first, I think, digital media organizing drive that has led to both digital and print organizing just exploding, and really, really, you know, nuts and bolts on the ground organizing. But in terms of, I think, this idea that young people, and maybe more highly educated young people, think unions are cool, and that is sort of a change even from Occupy, when, you know, activism was appealing, but not necessarily in the form of organizing. And one thing, you know, I hope that some people are digging more into this, but one of the things I see, and, you know, we all see the influence of people's engagement with Bernie Sanders presidential campaigns, especially the last one, and the massive explosive growth of the Democratic Socialists of America. And one of the things I've noticed is, you know, I think 10 years ago, left activists thought strikes were cool, but they didn't necessarily think organizing was cool. And when people outside of a workplace are egging people on to go on strike, it's kind of one of my pet peeves. It's people often who don't understand what it means to miss a paycheck, how hard strikes are, how difficult that decision is for the worker and their family, and sort of this idea that strikes are cool often minimizes the significance and the difficulty of making that decision. And I think now the many DSA members think organizing is cool, and that's something quite different. So they're going to Starbucks where there's an organizing drive and expressing support. They're salting, they're getting jobs at Starbucks and Amazon, and I think even UPS to try to increase Teamster militancy, and saying, you know, that would be a way to get involved. And I think that's a big change, and I think it's potentially significant. I hope someone's looking in to find out if it is significant, because it seems like it may well be.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. Oh, Gus, look, go ahead. I had a feeling this might trigger some additional conversation. Brother Gus, please.
Yeah, I want to thank Rebecca for those comments on striking. As somebody who has actually led a strike, then I agree with you. It's one of the worst things that anybody could do, and only should be done if it's necessary. And I think you opened up something there that is part of the issue that we're talking about today, is the lack of political education amongst those who engage in organizing. It's something that, if you're going to do this type of work, then, as Hamilton brought up earlier, one of my big mainstays is resources, and the resources necessary to sustain, first to ignite and sustain a social movement of something, whether you're recognizing the campaign or trying to get a contract, et cetera. I think those things are important. And one quick point I want to make is, although the young people are doing some good stuff now, we still can never forget 2018 with the West Virginia teacher strike, that wildcat strike that I argue was really the birth of kind of this idea of a rank and file led movement, because their strike was not only against the state, but it was against the international as well, in the sense that we need to change the ways in which we look at labor law, but also how we look at our relationships to the overall labor movement. And so I think that, and then of course, Los Angeles and Oklahoma, Arizona follow, but I think that 2018 is one of the most pivotal moments in US labor history, and that we need to be studying and documenting and educating people about that, and how that led to what you saw with the young people today, because that's where I guarantee that it came from.
Okay. Wow. And Ruth, I appreciate you're using the hand up.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, just in response to Gus, I agree that 2018, those teacher strikes were crucial, but I'll just add that they were led by young teachers, many of them DSA activists, and they were organized on Facebook and stuff. So that I don't see that as a separate phenomenon. It's, you know, part and parcel of it. I should have mentioned that as one of the examples though. So thanks for bringing that up.
Nolan, please. And then I will get to Ms. Park. Go ahead, Nolan.
I'll just jump into and echo. I really agree with what Gus said. And, you know, and the resources question is so important to me, because, like, you know, Starbucks to me is a great example, because Workers United has a formula that works. that's been demonstrated to work. They know how to organize it. They know how to spread it. It's very non-organizer intensive, you know, but it's only a Starbucks. Like why isn't it a McDonald's, Burger King? You know, every other fast food chain, every other retail chain. I mean, these are things that there has to be a structure of the labor movement itself that has the resources to replicate these things when they work. And that is really what's missing to me in the labor movement today. It's not that we can't find great examples everywhere. It's that where is the overarching structure that can project these things out in a powerful way.
Okay. All right. Well, we're going to turn to Miss Park. Are you still with us? I saw your.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm here.
Oh, yeah, go right
But-
ahead.
Yeah, I'm coming from South Korea, and because that's why I don't have, much. I might have much less knowledge about the labor movement in US, but I'm pretty sure it is a really exciting moment for the labor movement in the US. As an outsider, even as an outsider, I see that enthusiasm and such a excitement and all the things. So it's a kind of great moment to be here and watching all the things. My question is whether existing trade unions have enough capacity or willingness or space to accommodate all these new dynamics or new initiatives, new ideas, including the political activism and the social movement activism in labor movement, or it is better for this new movement, kind of new initiatives to create their own space, parallel to the existing trade union.
Very good. It's a great question. And if you don't mind my taking the prerogative, just to start, I'll call on one of the panelists. I see that Becky's hand is up, but actually I was staring right in the middle of the screen. I was staring at Ruth. So Ruth, would you like to take a shot at answering that? And then Becky?
Okay, sure. Great question. Look, I mean, it's true, as several people have already commented, that a lot of the initiative for all this has not come from the established labor leadership, but from the rank and file and or people outside of all of that who have been, assaulting or whatever. So that's a fact. But it comes back to the question I tried to raise at the end of my remarks before, which is the sustainability of this and whether it leads to anything lasting. And I think for that, unfortunately, there isn't really much alternative but to turn to the established union structures. And one would hope that, as Hamilton points out, there doesn't seem to be any kind of overall strategy for addressing this moment, which is what it is. It may not be a movement, but it's definitely a moment. And, we need that. And we need for all their problems, unions still have pretty deep pockets and a lot of expertise on how to negotiate contracts and all the rest of it. And I think we're beginning to see some of them step up, and they're as excited as the rest of us about these developments, which were really unexpected for them. I think they're so deeply, depressed and sort of, used to losing that this was not something that most people anticipated. But now that it's happening, I do see some evidence that some of them are stepping up, and I don't see how these new developments can prove sustainable without some kind of relationship to the so-called establishment of labor, even though, all the things people have said about that, I agree with. So.
Great. All right. We'll let Rebecca respond. And then Gus, I know you've seen the additional question in the chat, which is a really good one. I'll turn to you. You can repeat that question and then answer it. Okay. Rebecca.
Thank you. I really appreciate the question because I appreciate that you asked about capacity and vision. And I think I won't say too much because I think that Ruth kind of put it really well, which is we don't know if they have the vision. I think Hamilton has provided really sharp critiques at times of a real lack of vision, but they do have the capacity and nobody else has the capacity, right? So the resources sit with unions that have large numbers still, in spite of it all, of dues paying members. And so is there a vision to deploy those resources, right? I think that's kind of the critical issue, and we don't know the answer yet. And I think there's some potential, but it surely has not been delivered on. So it remains to be seen.
All right, Gus.
You're on mute.
Gus.
Sorry about that. Kate asked the question, how pivotal the West Virginia Wildcat strike was. And so the question is, are there parallels or lessons from pre-NLRA organizing that are useful for the current moment, or is the era too different? I would argue that there are. In fact, I think that one of the biggest things because I specialize in social movements. And one of the things I do argue, and one of our panelists mentioned this earlier, is that there seems to be this kind of bridge where traditional labor movement is more so in relation to mobilizing for events or contracts versus having an organizing model. And I think that one of the biggest things about organizing model, and this is what I take from Alden Morris, who wrote the amazing book, The Origins of the Civil Rights Movement, that every organization to have sustaining organizing potential in relation to capacity and resources has to be a local movement center. And that ties into what Rebecca and Ruth were both saying, is that the local movement center encompasses the vision, it encompasses the strategies, the tactics, and the space for leadership training, as well as the funding for all those things to occur. And as we mentioned before, under this political economy, the resources for a grassroots movement for rank and file workers exist in the labor movement. Now, one of the things in pre-NLRB days, when you look at those steelworker strikes or those San Francisco trucker strike, et cetera, they took very seriously the idea of local movement centers. Every particular issue had an organizing model to it. There was a strategy, there was political education. Everybody in the community participated, and community issues were union issues. They were always together. And I think one of the biggest issues, and when they went away from the social movement model, is they went away from the community being centrally focused in the struggle, in the activity. And a lot of those things are very important to building the support for the idea of a union. Even though you have small pockets here that are happening, it's not considered to be a widespread thing, because there was a pivot, and it happens around the 1940s and 50s. Of course, there are other factors that were involved, but I think that we just haven't gotten back to that element yet. And so one of the things I often emphasize is that there has to be some type of recognition or some type of reckoning in relation to how we organize with community members in social movement models under this current political economy, where all the resources are being stripped away on a daily basis. We haven't had a serious conversation about that reckoning yet.
Well, Gus, whatever you said got Ruth's hand back up. So I'm going to go back to Ruth.
Thanks. Well, I'm not sure whether the question was meant to get at this, but I'm somebody who's for a while been arguing that this is a period a lot like the pre-1935 period, in that because many of us have thought of the NLRA as kind of so crippled and corrupted by all the things that have happened since, that it was and yet, ironically, suddenly we're having all these NLRB elections at Amazon, at Starbucks, at all these other places. So we were wrong about that too, maybe. I mean, it's not that it's not broken, but it's sort of creaking along and they're winning, and so this was not supposed to be possible. So I think that's something to ponder as well. We're not going to get any labor law reform anytime soon, but we do have a pretty great head of the NLRB at the moment. And it seems like people have, somehow put new wine in that old bottle in a very effective way. So I mean, I didn't expect that. And I think it's pretty exciting.
Okay, go ahead, Hamilton. Yes, come back to you.
I was just going to add, I think one pre-NLRA thing that could be relevant today for organizing is, is charters for new unions. I mean, a century ago, that you didn't have to join an existing union. I mean, the AFL was just handing out charters like candy. If you worked at a textile factory and y'all wanted to organize, the AFL would give you a charter and you organize your union. And that kind of grassroots energy that we see today just among workers, and we're sitting here talking about how, major unions lack either the resources or the vision to take advantage of those things. One thing that might be useful is to go back to that idea of saying the AFL is a central part of the labor movement, and they have resources, but they're going to really give charters and give independence to all these workers that want to organize and support them and let a million new unions bloom.
All right. Well, I have a question that I want to throw out to the panel, but before I do so, I wanted to turn back to all of the folks who have joined us and see if there are any questions from you or comments. And if you're having trouble finding your raise hand button, you can just unmute yourself and speak up. So let me just look around, not seeing anyone. I do want to acknowledge that Mark in the chat has noted how engaging and informative this session is, particularly for a long career management guy. So hopefully we welcome you. We welcome everybody here in Lyra. So it's good to have a long career term management guy join us, and happy to hear from you. All right, so here's my question, because you've all said this, and I'm going to push you a little bit here. You've talked about this, what do you want to call it? A disconnect, a misalignment. We seem to have the conditions on the ground that are ripening for more organizing, and there is capacity, perhaps more or less within some established unions, but we're not seeing vision and capacity come together. So perhaps you want to offer your thoughts as to why not? Why are we not? Why is there not enough vision? And define that vision, if you would. So if you want to push a little bit here, and what do you think's missing? How do we get there? And what is that vision that you're talking so much about? And how about if I just, again, I'm going to throw it out there, and and actually, Hamilton, you were the first one to say there's no plan, right? Didn't seem to be a vision. And I wrote down in my note, well, what the hell's missing then? What's the problem? So Hamilton, you want to offer your thoughts on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the structural problem is that there's no structural incentive for, if you're the president of a union, your structural incentive is to serve the existing members of the union. The incentive to do new organizing is more of an ideological incentive, and that's the problem in a nutshell. I think that's the operational problem. And that's why you find so many unions just being conservative, just being sitting on a shrinking island, as like the water is encroaching, you're losing members every year, and you're like, what's the plan? And for the people that run the union, they're like, I got a decent job, like my members are happy, why do I care? So you need to have an ideological motivation to want to increase organizing and to believe that it's important to organize the unorganized workers. And I think, and we lack that at most of the powerful institutions in the labor movement, with some, important exceptions that I can think of. But I think structurally that is the problem.
Okay. All right. Rebecca, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with Hamilton. I also think, decades of being beat down and having really hostile labor law have just bred this real aversion to risk among people who rise to union leadership, and it's structural and it's understandable. I do think, there's some potential. I think, people who hang around labor spaces have probably heard from Sarah Nelson in recent years, and she certainly strikes a very different tone than the kind of labor leader we had perhaps become accustomed to. I also think, we'll see what Sean O'Brien does as president of the Teamsters. He's talking a lot about taking on Amazon, and we all know the UPS contract is coming up, and his rhetoric certainly marks a significant shift, and we'll see what backs it up. I'll also say something interesting that I'm kind of sliding in that sort of response to your question, but I also think there's something interesting about a lot of people are talking about the exciting new workers, and they're turning everything upside down, and they've got new ways of organizing and new energy and all of that. But I also think there's some really significant ways in which some, I'm going to call them labor movement old timers, are critical here, in ways often sort of individualized advice, but Richard Bensinger really doing what a true staff organizer does, right? Empowering workers to self-organize, but providing the resources, the advice, the legal support as they're needed, with workers leading the way. And Jean Bruskin, those lessons, right, from Smithfield, then being, offered to Amazon labor union organizers, again, in the way that we want someone who's not necessarily in the rank and file to do that, right? It's advice that's available, and the workers need to lead. And I think so there is some connection between stuff that we can say the old ways or the old guard those ways weren't working, but I think there are some connections we don't want to totally overlook as well.
Wonderful. Oh, that's very good. Gus, how about your thoughts?
I think both Hamilton and Rebecca are spot on. Just to add a little historical context to both their answers, I think a lot of it does, you have to go back to the original National Labor Relations Act. And I know Ruth brought this up earlier, and that it was pretty much the precedent was set from its initial origin to decimate it from day one. And so that's why in the 1940s, the 50s and 60s, they continued to pick away at it. But at the very beginning, there was this kind of embedded liberalism at the heart of the creation of this relationship that said that there was going to be a kind of streamlining of militancy, and it was going to be a shift from union labor movements to industrial relations, and some of us being in industrial, in labor and employment relations departments. We know the history of how those things played a major role is shifting the dynamics as well as the visions for the labor movement over the next 3 to 4 decades. And then, of course, we go into the political economy shift from industrial to financial capital, the loss of resources. So in other words, what Hamilton and Rebecca said are spot on. And these are the main kinds of questions that we're talking a lot about. And when we speak about these things and we talk about, we need staff organizers, we need paid staff organizers, because rank and file members originally in the original days, they could organize their spaces. They had the time to do it, but now you have people working 12, 13-hour shifts. There's no funding to pay things. We need paid staff organizers to do that. So again, having these conversations and putting the historical context to them is really important to really trying to say, okay, we can no longer talk about we're going to do this or there's this campaign, but we have to have an actual reawakening of the labor movement and create a whole new strategy and tactics, which takes a long time. I'm not saying it's an easy thing, but the fact that we haven't tried it yet is the worst part of it all. And so the response on the ground are rank and file committees, Starbucks organizing, the Fight for 15 movement. Wildcat strikes are up 100+% over the past 4 years. And again, these things have to be talked about because there's something coming very soon because of all these things that are gearing. So. Okay.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn to Ruth finally on this. And Ruth, if you care to, Michael Hillard has asked us to perhaps comment, well, what about those bigger unions that really in past decades did a fair amount of organizing, and certainly SEIU. Michael also mentions the Teamsters, and SEIU has done a great deal of work to support the Fight for 15 movement. You're not exactly unconnected to an established union. So if you care to work that into your response, go right ahead.
Yes, thank you. That's right in line with what I was thinking before you called on me. When Gus said he was going to put in some historical perspective, I was thinking, oh, he's going to say what I'm going to say. But I have in mind a more recent historical period, which is the 1990s. Not everybody here is old enough to remember all that, but some of us are. And that was a period when what some people called the AFL-CIO, the AFL-CIO under John Sweeney, did indeed, along with the New Voices, executive board, embraced the idea of organizing the unorganized, and they really did encourage unions to pour resources into that. And, you know, they tried it. And I think part of the disillusion that Rebecca was talking about, the sense of defeatism, is that it didn't quite do the job. They actually did manage to stop the bleeding for a few years in the late 1990s. You know, Sweeney came in 1995, and there were, I don't remember exactly which years, but between then and 2000, there were a few years where, you know, union density was flat instead of continuing its long-term decline. So that was an achievement. But we know from, you know, people have analyzed this in detail, just to keep union density stable requires a lot of new organizing, and to move the needle, you know, up requires much more. So, but anyway, they tried. And I think Fight for 15 is one of the legacies of that effort. And by the way, there's been a fair amount of ongoing organizing in other sectors by unions like SEIU that is kind of an unsung story. There's a piece in the current issue of New Labor Forum or maybe it's not in print yet, but online anyway, by Stuart Eimer that documents this for SEIU. So some unions have continued to do this, including the flight attendants right now are trying to organize at Delta. And, you know, there's some of that happening. The problem is scale, as Hamilton said at the beginning. And that we haven't got there yet. But I think the defeatism that Rebecca highlighted, you know, it's rooted in that very history, because, you know, labor leaders tend to stick around quite a long time until they retire or perish. And so they all remember this stuff. And, you know, I think another example is the effort to organize at Walmart, which, you know, went on for a decade. The UFCW poured resources into it and they got nowhere. So we can point to all the things they might have done better and all that. But, you know, that's the backdrop to the defeatism, all of that history. So, but, you know, it's not like there's no new organizing happening though, except for like Amazon and Starbucks. That's not true. It's just not kind of in the center of the media spotlight. But anyway, yeah.
Oh, no, that was great. And I was going to note that there was a story about the large rise. I forget exactly what that percentage rise was, but it was very large in the number of petitions that have been taken out at the board. In fact, I took some pride in noting that the Chicago region was second or third in terms of the most activism. So we've got Johnny Callis has put a note here in the chat box for everyone. This has been mentioned, but what are the implications of these important new efforts, Starbucks and Amazon going through, perfect timing, through the outdated board process? Is this a sustainable model? Can we expect Amazon or Starbucks workers to be able to negotiate a first contract? Oh boy. All right, well, who wants to take that on? Who's got the answer to that? Well, Becca, look at that. She jumped right into the
I don't know if I have the answer, but I have more questions, which is there's no alternative to organizing. So if you didn't do the NLRB process and you wanted to, you know, fight and potentially strike for so-called voluntary recognition, you'd have to have exceptional on-the-ground organizing to win that. And if you organize and win an NLRB election, you're going to have exceptional sustained on the ground organizing to win that contract. And you're going to have to be just as ready to take action and stay organized. And so I don't know the answer to whether any of them will get contracts. I know that it'll be hard and it'll depend on the ability to sustain organizing, which comes back to that question of resources, right? Do they have sufficient resources to do that? If more salts keep coming in, so we know, for example, Amazon is so high turnover, anybody can get a job there. And so if politically activated people keep salting whichever warehouses have won elections, then maybe they will be action ready, you know?
Wonderful. That's very hopeful. Yeah, Hamilton, please.
I'm just going to say on a timely note on that. I mean, yesterday, y'all might have seen the statement from Microsoft about, Microsoft put out a statement essentially implying that they would consider voluntarily recognizing any union organizing. They're trying to get ahead of union organizing at their own company, and saying they don't plan to union bust in the way that Amazon and other places have. And I mean, I think people go through the NLRB election process because they have to, because they can't get voluntary recognition. And like Rebecca said, it's hard to build to a strike before you have a union. And in big shops, that can be a very tenuous thing. So, I mean, I think it's very important for the labor movement to try to evolve the expectation that voluntary recognition will come to be expected as a minimal standard of decency for corporations, you know, and seeing a company like Microsoft come out and say that yesterday, I think was at least a hopeful sign that we might be moving down that path to where it's not just publicly acceptable to be an asshole union buster anymore.
Okay, now we had the FU in, we got the asshole union buster. This is great. This is great. We haven't been shut down yet. I'm sure glad we're recording. Gus, you got a thought on this line of comments?
No, my colleagues said it perfectly. There is some hope there. There's also been some really awesome groundwork in organizing gig workers, platform workers, et cetera. There's some really cool organizations in Chicago. I know, Bob, you and other scholars are doing really awesome reports on gig workers and their experiences in organizing as well. So in other words, there's a lot of activity. And I think that one of the best things that I think the past few decades have done is that you do have people asking a lot more critical questions about these types of things that have led to the research coming out, reports and papers, et cetera. So there's some really good scholarship that's asking the questions that should be driving a lot of the things that we transfer to the grassroots struggles. So there is a lot of potential for those types of relationships right now.
Okay, very good. And thanks for the shout out, Brother Gus. Ruth, a last word on this line of comment and question?
I think I've said what I have to say, but I do want to make just a shout out to Johnny Callis, who spoke up indirectly in the chat, who some of you know is doing great work in documenting the strikes that do take place, and something that has not been done systematically by the government like it once was. And so thank you for doing that, Johnny. It's really appreciated. I hope lots of people on the call will take advantage of it if you don't already know about it.
Yeah, yes, very good. Also in the chat, and I really appreciate the way people are using the chat. Zachary has noted a piece of scholarship by Farber and Western from 2001. You can't out-organize non-union employment growth, but that reasonable organization rates would be sufficient to turn the needle. Piece of research people can take a look at. Also, oh, there you go. Johnny gave us strikebreaker.ilr.cornell.edu. We've seen it. Victor Navarro wants to know, anyone want to speak to the recent increase of union organizing in the nonprofit sector? And if
I'll jump in.
Go ahead.
I'll jump in and just say, to me, that looks a lot like what we're seeing in something like digital media, where just shops are going down like dominoes, and there's so much of relationship between workers in those different workplaces. They're all already talking to each other. It's not like they have to do that in order to organize. They all already knew each other. There's some mobility between shops. And again, it's numerically small if you talk about rebuilding the labor movement, but really significant within the industry. And I think, you know, potentially really powerful. So yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. I think that's worth noting for sure.
I just have to add that it's another case of these highly educated, underpaid young people who are doing it. Yeah.
The thing we haven't actually mentioned is one of the things that's happening is calling these employers to account on their rhetoric. So, you know, we see it dramatically with Starbucks, where they claim to be a progressive, nice employer, and they're just as bad as Walmart. Amazon barely claims to be progressive and nice, although they do, you know, put up some Black Lives Matter sort of stuff from time to time. But I think these, you know, especially progressive nonprofits, although we're seeing, you know, some pretty nasty union busting in places like Planned Parenthood and the Scholars Strategy Network, which was very disheartening. But I think this idea, this ability of young, sharp, smart, educated workers to hold their employers to account and say, you can't claim to be supporting, you know, these vague diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and then union bust. I think that that's significant too.
Well, we're at the end of our session. Rebecca noted that there was something that we hadn't mentioned. I've got a whole page of here that I never got to, but that's, I guess that's a sign of a lot of important conversation and a lot of important things to talk about. I want to thank everybody for your participation. I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to address some other topics. I want to thank Michael Lilich for the kind comments to the panel. And let me really especially thank Rebecca and Gus and Ruth and Hamilton for being willing to have these conversations. And I'll certainly encourage you to continue to do the kind of great work that you do. And to the rest of you, stay engaged, and hopefully you'll enjoy the rest of the LYRA conference, and we will see you down the road at some point. So with that, have a wonderful weekend. Thank you. Take care.